She sat in the back row, clutching a paddle no one expected her to raise. While billionaires fought over flashy paintings, she paid $60 for a shattered, dirty mirror bound for the trash. They laughed. But the joke was on them. Behind that cracked glass hid $30 million. The grand ballroom of the sprawling Pendleton estate in Newport, Rhode Island, smelled heavily of polished mahogany, expensive perfume, and old money. Arthur Pendleton, a notorious railroad heir and obsessive antiquities hoarder, had passed away 6 months prior, leaving behind a mansion stuffed to the rafters with centuries of forgotten history. Tonight, the most exclusive auction house on the East Coast, the prestigious firm of Sotheby and Wellington, was liquidating the absolute best of his collection. Clara Hayes did not belong here. A 32-year-old freelance art conservator, with a perpetually smudged apron stuffed into her tote bag, she sat invisible in the very last row of velvet-lined chairs. Surrounded by hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and private museum curators, Clara was entirely out of her depth. Her bank account held exactly $840, a meager sum she hoped to invest in a minor overlooked piece she could restore and flip to keep her struggling Brooklyn studio afloat. For 3 hours she watched as astronomical sums were casually thrown across the room. A beautifully preserved Louis XIV commode sold for $2.4 million. A dusty but authenticated sketch by John Singer Sargent went for $800,000. The wealthy attendees murmured in polite approval, sipping champagne served on silver trays. Sitting 2 rows ahead of Clara was Alistair Montgomery, a ruthless venture capitalist known throughout the antique world for his aggressive buying tactics and insufferable arrogance. Alistair had already spent over $6 million tonight, bidding with a bored flick of his wrist. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit and had a habit of loudly scoffing whenever a piece didn't meet his exacting, pretentious standards. As the evening dragged on and the crowd began to grow weary, the auctioneer, a tall, severe man named Charles Higgins, signaled for the porters to bring out lot 314. The room collectively sighed in disappointment. 2 white-gloved handlers lugged a heavy, incredibly tarnished silver vanity mirror onto the illuminated stage. It was a massive, unwieldy thing, roughly 3 feet tall and heavily ornamented with blackened, oxidized floral motifs. But the worst part was the glass itself. The mirror was severely cracked, a violent spiderweb of fractured glass radiating from a deep central impact point, rendering it completely useless. It looked like something salvaged from a haunted house or a damp basement. Lot 314. Charles Higgins announced, his tone lacking the enthusiasm he had reserved for the Sargent sketch. A late 19th century silver-plated vanity mirror. Maker unknown. Provenance largely undocumented. Found in the late Mr. Pendleton's sub-basement storage. The silver is heavily oxidized, and the glass is, as you can see, significantly compromised. We will open the bidding at $200. Silence descended upon the grand ballroom. Nobody raised a paddle. $200, Higgins repeated, looking around the room. Do I have 200? More silence. A few people checked their watches. Alistair Montgomery let out a loud theatrical chuckle. Belongs in a landfill, Charles, he called out, drawing a wave of polite, snobbish laughter from the surrounding elite. Let's move on to the good stuff. Nobody wants Pendleton's literal garbage. Higgins frowned, looking embarrassed for the auction house. Very well. Do I have $100? 100 for the silver frame alone. Clara stared intently at the mirror. Even from 50 feet away, her trained conservator's eyes noticed something the billionaires had missed. The tarnish on the metal wasn't the flat, dull grey of cheap silver plate. It had the deep, rich, almost purple-black iridescence of solid, high-purity sterling. Moreover, the floral carvings on the frame were incredibly intricate, boasting the distinct asymmetrical rococo curves characteristic of 18th century French silversmithing, not 19th century reproductions. It was ugly broken and filthy, but it was not garbage. $50. Higgins asked, clearly preparing to pass the lot entirely. Any interest at $50 before we withdraw the item? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slowly raised her white plastic paddle. Number 402. Higgins looked genuinely surprised. $50 to paddle 402. Thank you, madam. Do I hear 60? Clara held her breath. 60, a voice drawled. It was Alistair Montgomery. He wasn't even looking at the mirror. He was looking back over his shoulder at Clara, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. He was bidding purely to humiliate the poorly dressed woman in the back row, treating the auction like his own personal playground. Clara swallowed hard, her palms sweating. She raised her paddle again. 70. 80. Alistair shot back, instantly taking a sip of his champagne. 90. Clara counted her voice, trembling slightly. Alistair laughed aloud. He turned his back to her, clearly bored of his own cruel game. "Let the junk collector have it," he muttered loudly to his companion. "I wouldn't let that cursed-looking thing into my garage." Higgins tapped his gavel. $90 going once. Going twice. Sold for $90 to paddle 402. Clara exhaled a shaky breath, sinking back into her velvet chair. The immediate rush of adrenaline faded, replaced by a sudden wave of crippling doubt. Had she just wasted nearly $100 on a useless piece of shattered glass? The mirror was huge. She would have to pay a small fortune just to transport it back to New York. The wealthy attendees around her were already whispering, casting pitying, judgmental glances her way. When Clara went to the cashier's desk to settle her bill, the clerk handed her the receipt with a look of barely concealed disdain. The porters wrapped the heavy, awkward mirror in thick, moving blankets and loaded it into the back of her rented van. As she drove away from the glittering, brightly lit mansion and into the dark, foggy Rhode Island night, Clara couldn't shake the terrible feeling that she had made a massive mistake. The mirror was incredibly heavy, far heavier than it should have been. She blamed the solid wood backing, entirely unaware that she was driving down the interstate with a secret that powerful men would gladly destroy her to possess. The rain lashed against the grimy windows of Clara's Brooklyn studio, casting long, wavering shadows across her cluttered workbenches. The space smelled sharply of acetone beeswax and aged wood. It was past 2 in the morning, but Clara could not sleep. The broken mirror, now resting flat on her central restoration table under a harsh, glaring halogen lamp, seemed to demand her absolute attention. Stripped of its moving blankets, the object looked even more imposing. Clara put on her magnifying headlamp and a pair of blue nitrile gloves, leaning over the shattered glass. Her first task was to assess the frame. She dipped a cotton swab into a mild chemical solvent and began to gently rub at a small obscured section of the blackened silver near the bottom corner. After a few minutes of careful circular polishing, the thick layer of oxidation gave way. Clara gasped. Beneath the century of grime, the metal gleamed with a brilliant, blinding, white-hot luster. She grabbed her jeweler's loupe and peered closely at the freshly cleaned spot. There, stamped cleanly into the silver, were 3 tiny hallmarks, a crowned letter P, a small boar's head, and the unmistakable signature of Jean-Baptiste Claude Odiot, one of the most legendary silversmiths of 18th century Paris. Her hands began to shake. This wasn't a cheap 19th century knockoff. It was an original French masterpiece, likely commissioned for royalty. Even with the shattered glass, the frame alone was worth at least $40,000. She had multiplied her investment 400 times over in a single night. But as Clara meticulously documented her findings, the nagging feeling from the auction returned. The weight. When she had lifted the mirror from the van, it had nearly thrown out her back. An antique mirror of this size, even heavily framed in silver, should have weighed no more than 20 pounds. This behemoth weighed closer to 50. She turned her attention to the back of the piece. It was covered by a thick, seamless slab of dark Honduran mahogany. Curiously, there were no visible nail screws or wooden pegs holding the backboard in place. The wood was flawlessly flush against the silver rim, perfectly sealed. How had the original glass been installed? How could it be replaced? Clara ran her gloved fingertips along the very edge where the wood met the silver. She felt a subtle, almost microscopic groove running the entire length of the frame. It wasn't just a backing, it was a sliding panel. She retrieved a thin steel spatula from her toolkit and tried to pry the wood upward. It didn't budge a single millimeter. It was locked. For the next 2 hours, Clara meticulously examined every inch of the intricately carved silver foliage on the front. If there was a lock, there had to be a release mechanism hidden within the elaborate Rococo design. She pressed on silver leaves, pulled on carved vines, and twisted ornate floral buds. Nothing. Frustration mounting, Clara stared at the deep spiderweb crack in the center of the mirror. The point of impact was incredibly specific, a concentrated strike right in the center of a frosted glass, rose etched into the bottom pane. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed a thick wooden dowel and placed it gently against the shattered center of the etched rose. She pressed down firmly. A sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet studio. Clara jumped back, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, with a low, grinding scrape of internal gears that hadn't moved in 2 centuries, the heavy mahogany backboard slid downward exactly 2 inches, revealing a hollow cavity between the wood and the silver. Trembling, Clara grabbed the edge of the mahogany board and pulled it the rest of the way down. The back came off, completely exposing the hidden interior of the mirror. The cavity was lined with faded crimson velvet. Resting carefully inside were 2 items. The first was a thick bundle of heavily yellowed parchment, bound tightly with cracked leather cord. The second was a heavy object wrapped in dark, oiled cloth. Clara carefully lifted the oiled cloth first. As she unwrapped it on her workbench, the harsh light of the halogen lamp hit the object, throwing a sudden dizzying kaleidoscope of fractured blue light across the ceiling and walls of her studio. She stopped breathing. Resting on the workbench was a sapphire the size of a chicken egg, cut into a perfect teardrop shape. It was utterly flawless, a deep oceanic blue that seemed to glow with its own internal fire. Clara was no gemologist, but she had spent enough time around museum collections to recognize a stone of immense historical significance. This wasn't just a jewel, this was a crown jewel. Hands shaking violently, she turned her attention to the bundle of parchment. She untied the brittle leather cord and gently unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and undeniably old. She skimmed the faded ink, picking out names that made her stomach drop. Thomas Jefferson, William Dewar, the French crown. The letters detailed a desperate clandestine transaction during the height of the French Revolution. French aristocrats had smuggled the tear of the ocean, a legendary sapphire believed to have been lost to history, into the newly formed United States, using it as collateral to secure secret funding from American financiers. The mirror had been custom-built to hide the gem and the treasonous correspondence. Clara stared at the fortune sitting on her workbench. The sapphire alone was easily worth $30 million. The historical documents were priceless. She was completely alone in a dark Brooklyn studio with the discovery of the century. Suddenly, the harsh ringing of her cell phone shattered the dead silence of the room. Clara jolted, nearly knocking over a bottle of solvent. She looked at the caller ID on her phone. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, she swiped to answer, holding the phone to her ear. "Hello," she whispered. "Ms. Hayes." A smooth, chillingly familiar voice drawled on the other end of the line. It was Alistair Montgomery. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I've been doing some thinking about that ugly little trinket you bought tonight. I find myself in need of a restoration project. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the mirror right now tonight. My driver is already waiting outside your studio." Clara's blood ran cold. She slowly walked to her frosted window and peered through a small scrape in the glass. Parked directly across the street, idling in the pouring rain, was a sleek black town car. Alistair hadn't called to buy a mirror. He knew exactly what was inside. Clara stood frozen by the window, the cold draft from the rain-slicked glass chilling her to the bone. The black town car sat idling its headlights, cutting through the heavy Brooklyn downpour like predatory eyes. Alistair Montgomery had not called to negotiate. He had called to trap her. Panic-sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in her mouth. She dropped the phone onto her workbench and scrambled toward the secret compartment of the broken vanity mirror. The odiate silver frame, once a beautiful relic, now felt like a curse. Clara knew that men like Alistair did not simply buy things they wanted when they could just as easily take them. She grabbed a heavy-duty waterproof document tube from her drafting table. With agonizing care, she rolled the fragile yellowed letters detailing the treasonous American funding of the French Revolution, sliding them into the protective plastic. Next, she snatched a padded velvet-lined jeweler's box, placing the breathtaking $30 million tear of the ocean sapphire inside, and shoved both into the bottom of her reinforced canvas backpack. She left the heavy, odiate silver frame and the shattered glass on the table. She couldn't run with 50 pounds of antique silver. Downstairs, the heavy iron gate of her building's entrance rattled violently. Someone was forcing the lock. Clara sprinted to the back of her studio, throwing open the rusted deadbolt of the emergency exit. The heavy metal door groaned, opening onto a narrow, pitch-black alleyway that smelled of damp brick and rotting leaves. As she stepped out onto the iron fire escape, she heard the unmistakable sound of her studio's front door splintering open. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor inside. "Find her! Don't let her leave with the package!" A deep voice barked from within her apartment. Clara did not look back. She descended the wet, slippery metal stairs 2 at a time, her boots splashing into the puddles of the alley. She pulled her hood up, melting into the shadows of the storm, and ran blindly toward the nearest subway station. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the relentless pounding of the rain. She knew she couldn't go to the police. A freelance restorer claiming a billionaire was hunting her over a cursed mirror, and a giant sapphire would be dismissed as a lunatic, giving Alistair the perfect window to intercept her. She needed an expert. She needed Winston Carmichael. An hour later, soaking wet and shivering, Clara stood in the dimly lit foyer of a sprawling Upper West Side brownstone. Winston Carmichael, a retired senior curator of European antiquities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Clara's former university mentor, stared at her over the rim of his tortoise-shell glasses. He was in his silk dressing gown, looking thoroughly bewildered. "Clara, my dear, it is 3 a.m, Winston muttered, ushering her into his study, a room walled entirely with thousands of leather-bound books. "What on earth could possess you to—" Clara unzipped her backpack. Without a word, she withdrew the waterproof tube and the jeweler's box, placing them onto his massive oak desk. She opened the box. Winston's words died in his throat. He slowly reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a high-powered jeweler's loupe. He picked up the tear of the ocean with trembling, age-spotted hands. For 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock. "Good heavens!" Winston finally whispered, his voice cracking. "It's real. The internal inclusions, the specific cut. It is the missing French crown jewel. It hasn't been seen since 1792. Read the letters, Winston. Clara urged, pacing the Persian rug. It's not just the sapphire. The letters explain how it got here, and they explain why Alistair Montgomery is trying to kill me for it. Winston carefully unrolled the parchment. As his eyes darted across the faded French script, his face drained of colour. He looked up at Clara, utter horror in his eyes. "The financier," Winston said slowly. "The man who accepted the jewel from the fleeing French aristocrats, promising to hold it in trust. It was Bartholomew Montgomery, Alistair's great-great-grandfather. Bartholomew claimed the ship carrying the jewel sank. He kept the sapphire, used the hidden funds to establish the Montgomery banking empire, and left the French nobles to the guillotine." Clara stopped pacing. So Alistair's entire generational wealth is built on stolen sovereign assets and the blood of betrayed allies. Winston finished setting the letter down as if it were on fire. If the French government or the international banking authorities see these documents, the Montgomery Empire will be seized. Alistair would lose everything. The historical fraud alone would trigger international asset forfeiture. He isn't after the gem, Clara. He's after the paper. Suddenly the heavy brass knocker on Winston's front door slammed 3 times. The sound echoed through the quiet brownstone like a gunshot. Clara and Winston froze. "Ms. Hayes," Alistair's voice floated through the solid oak door, calm and dripping with malice. "I know you are in there. I tracked the GPS on your cellular device. How terribly careless of you." Clara's blood ran cold. She had been so panicked she hadn't even thought to turn off her phone. She was trapped again, but this time she had dragged her only friend into the crosshairs. "Winston, I am so sorry." Clara breathed tears of frustration, pricking her eyes. "Nonsense, my dear," Winston whispered, his eyes suddenly burning with a fierce, unexpected defiance. "I have spent my entire life preserving history. I will be damned if I let a spoiled, thieving aristocrat destroy it." Winston moved swiftly to the fireplace, pressing hard against a seemingly ordinary brick. With a soft click, a narrow, dark servant's passage from the 1800s opened behind the bookshelf. "Take the bag. Go through the tunnels. They lead to the maintenance access of the adjacent subway line. I will stall them." "I can't leave you," Clara protested. "I am a highly respected septuagenarian with heart trouble," Winston said grimly. "If he lays a finger on me, he faces life in prison. He won't hurt me. He only wants the bag. Go now." Clara grabbed the backpack, threw herself into the narrow, cobweb-filled darkness, and pushed the bookshelf closed, just as the sound of splintering wood echoed from the front hall. She ran blindly through the damp, claustrophobic tunnel, the sound of her own terrified breathing loud in her ears. She emerged 20 minutes later through a rusted grate into the cavernous, echoing expanse of an underground subway service tunnel. She was safe for the moment, but running was no longer an option. Alistair Montgomery had limitless resources. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth to protect his family's stolen legacy. If she wanted to survive, she had to strip him of his power. Sitting on a damp concrete ledge in the subway tunnels, Clara pulled out her phone. She disabled her GPS, then opened her web browser. She didn't call the police. She called the one force in the world that billionaires feared more than the law, the press. She found the emergency contact number for Sarah Jenkins, a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist for the New York Times, known for taking down corrupt politicians and corporate titans. Clara snapped high-resolution photos of every single page of the Montgomery treason letters, alongside perfectly lit photos of the tear of the ocean resting on the day's newspaper. She attached them to an encrypted email with the subject line, "The foundation of the Montgomery Empire is stolen blood money. Call me in exactly 10 minutes." 10 minutes later, her phone rang. Who is this? Sarah Jenkins demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. Are these documents authenticated? My name is Clara Hayes. I am a professional art conservator, and Winston Carmichael of the MET can verify the Odiot silver and the Odiot provenance, Clara said rapidly. Alistair Montgomery's men are hunting me right now. If you want the exclusive story of the century, you need to bring federal authorities and a camera crew to the main concourse of Grand Central Terminal in exactly 1 hour. At 5 a.m., the massive vaulted ceiling of Grand Central Terminal was eerily empty, bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning. Clara stood perfectly still in the dead center of the floor, beneath the famous four-faced opal clock. She felt incredibly small, completely exposed and terrified. Alistair Montgomery walked out from the shadows of the east archway. He was alone, his custom suit impeccably dry, despite the storm outside. He smiled a cold, predatory grimace. "You are a very stubborn woman, Miss Hayes," Alistair echoed his voice, carrying across the empty station. "But I must admit I admire your tenacity. I am prepared to offer you $5 million, tax-free, wired to an offshore account of your choosing. Hand over the bag and you can disappear to a private island. Abo!" "The letters aren't for sale, Alistair," Clara said, gripping the straps of her backpack. "And neither is the sapphire. It belongs in a museum. It belongs to history." Alistair's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "History is written by the men who survive it, Clara. You are a nobody. You fix old furniture in a damp basement. Do you really think anyone will miss you?" He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a sleek, suppressed handgun. "Give me the bag. I don't think you understand," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. She pointed up toward the balcony overlooking the concourse. Alistair followed her gaze. Suddenly, a blinding array of camera flashes erupted from the upper level. Sarah Jenkins stood at the railing, flanked by 3 men wearing jackets with the bold yellow letters FBI Art Crime Team. "Drop the weapon, Mr. Montgomery." A booming voice echoed over a megaphone. Heavily armed federal agents swarmed the floor from every exit, their weapons trained squarely on the billionaire. Alistair froze, the color draining from his arrogant face as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The cameras were rolling. The federal agents were here. The secret his family had murdered to protect was out in the open. Slowly, his hands shaking violently, he dropped the gun to the marble floor. Within days, the story became the biggest international scandal of the decade. The Montgomery assets were frozen by the International Criminal Court. Alistair was indicted for attempted murder, grand larceny, and historical fraud. The tear of the ocean was rightfully returned to the French government, where it was placed on permanent display at the Louvre, right next to the meticulously restored, perfectly polished Odiot silver mirror. Clara Hayes did not walk away empty-handed. As the lawful discoverer of the artifact, the International Antiquities Court awarded her a 10% finder's fee on the recovered assets. She walked out of the courtroom a millionaire, proving to the world that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the most shattered reflections. What a wild journey, from a $60 auction mistake to exposing a billionaire's darkest family secrets. Clara's story proves you should never judge a book by its cover or a mirror by its cracks. If you loved this deep dive into real-life historical mysteries and thrilling treasure hunts, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the sapphire?